Howdy, Crumb Bums! It's time for the inaugural episode of Canonically Crumb, the only show that examines the comics and characters of the Crummy-verse. Now, a lot of R.Crumb characters are fairly one-dimensional. They only have a handful of appearances. Your Boingy Baxters, the old Pooparoo, Forky O'Donnell. These are characters that don't require a lot of stabs to get to the meat, as it were. One episode will get her done in most cases. But that's not the case with today's program. Folks, we're starting the show with what will be, I'm sure, the first of many episodes into our deep dive into this iconic Crummy-verse character. It's time for Mr. Natural, Part 1, the Pre-Zap Years. Now, before we start, we need to acknowledge that for our purposes, Robert Crumb's canon includes the Big Yum Yum book, the Complete Crumb, the Weirdo Years, Zap, Hup, Mystic Funnies, and a bit of Dirty Laundry. I won't count any sketchbook work outside of what's in the books that I mentioned, and really nothing after Mystic Funnies. Now, without further ado, we can move on to the man from Afghanistan, that madcap mystic, Mr. Natural. Part huckster, part sage, all libido. He's the diagenetic trickster that dispenses cosmic wisdom for the price of a hamburger. Appearing as the archetypical long-bearded cartoon hermit, a stock cartoon character that's existed in cartooning since the start and continues to this day, picture a character with the proverbial "the end is near" sign, and you're probably looking at something resembling Mr. Natural. A parody of the Maharishi Mahesh Guru and other gurus of the time, the Natch is one of the characters that emerged from Crumb's psyche during an extended post-LSD haze in 1966. Reading from the Complete Crumb Volume 4, and what a boon to my art. It was during that fuzzy period that I recorded in my sketchbook all the main characters I would be using in my comics for the next 10 years. Mr. Natural, Flaky Foont, Schumann the Human, the Snoid, Exactly, the Vulture Demonesses, Shabno the Shoehorn Dog, this one, that one, which is interesting. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, like a religious vision that changes someone's life. But in my case, it was a psychotic manifestation of some grimy part of America's collective unconscious. His first canonical appearance, therefore, was about a year prior to his first published comics. Here we find in Crumb's sketchbook, dated March 1966, Mr. Natural outwits Flaky Foont. How appropriate that these two are paired up in both of their first appearances. We open with Mr. Natural giving an impromptu, holistic lecture to a captivated crowd, evidently before his beard turned white. Next, a woman asks him to cure her bronchial infection. Mr. Natural climbs into her throat and horrifically starts yanking organs. Humorously, he declares, "My work here is done." Enter an extremely large-footed and somewhat weaselly-looking Flaky, who proceeds to trap Mr. Natural in a small shed filled with all things artificial, canned food, cheap paperbacks, TV, and so on. Of course, Mr. Natural, ever the foil to Flaky, fakes his own suicide and slips past Foont to freedom. He then reminds Foont that he has an irrational, emotional compulsion. We know Crumb uses an impromptu approach to comic making. He's essentially doodling these comics, so it's interesting to imagine the characters revealing themselves to him for the first time. And this comic makes perfect sense in that context, if you imagine it starting from the title and then unfolding from there. Who is Mr. Natural? Mr. Natural, well, he must be a guru type. So where does that go? Well, it's Crumb, so it goes into some fucked up sex fantasies, obviously. He's tapping into the id. Oh, what about Flaky Foont from the title? Well, this is him, I guess. And what does Flaky Foont want to do to Mr. Natural? Well, obviously, trap him in a world of artificiality. But of course, we already know that Mr. Natural outwits Foont from the title. So bing bang boom, fakes his own death and escapes. Well, the relationship between Flaky and Natural is a little more sinister in their first appearance, and Flaky's future attempts to get Mr. Natural are infrequent and more prank-like. There are still a lot of recognizable elements of the characters here. Mr. Natural has a long beard and robe. He's a charismatic figure, a holistic healer, and he's more clever than Flaky. Moving on, in spring of '66, we get Mr. Natural Falls in Love. We find Mr. Natural dispensing advice and dispensing advice and dispensing advice. He can't escape his followers. Exhausted, he resolves to take a vacation, but he misses his train due to what else? Dispensing more wisdom. Luckily, the conductor has a special train just for the Natch, a little comfy caboose. While Mr. Natural is sleeping, his cart rolls into the ocean, but as it turns out, this is perfect for his vacation plans. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a woman swims by, barely acknowledging him, and Mr. Natural cries, "Hey, come back here!" Based on the title, I would say that this is the woman who Mr. Natural has fallen in love with. I guess the idea is that he doesn't want anybody when he's surrounded by tons of people and they all want him. But when he's in the middle of nowhere, he falls in love with the woman who barely notices him. Really, this comic should be called Mr. Natural Takes a Vacation, which is exactly what Crumb will do with it 3 years later in Zap number 4. Here we get basically the same story as in the sketchbook one that we just looked at, only it's longer with more sex. He doesn't take the train like in the sketchbook comic, but the houseboat is very similar to his personal caboose. The ending is the same, albeit stretched out over more panels. This second appearance adds a bit more to Natural's character that we'll see carry through all the way to Mystic Funnies. Fans are forever pestering Mr. Natural, and he seeks solitude from them. Next, in June of '67, we get a comic simply titled Mr. Natural, or as the Complete Crumb calls it in the contents page, Mr. Natural's School of Wisdom. Broke, Mr. Natural tries to drum up some business. Unfortunately, the normies ignore him and think he's crazy. And the hippies? Well, they're interested, but they call him a lousy capitalist when he tries to make some money. Still in desperate need of funds, Mr. Natural has an idea. Panhandling. In addition to representing the largest break from Mr. Natural Crumb will take for the next decade, this comic establishes that Mr. Natural is indeed a bit of a huckster. Leading up to his first print appearance, we get a handful of 6 to 8 panel strips that are largely conversational. Most feature Flaky Foont looking for answers. These strips are mostly inconsequential in terms of canon. However, they do establish that Mr. Natural is indeed in possession of some occult wisdom, like having the answer and not being at all surprised when God makes it rain frogs. Then, in May of 1967, in the first issue of Yarrow-Stocks magazine, or is it Yarrow-Stocks? Thoughts in the comments. We get the first published appearance of Mr. Natural in Mr. Natural the Zen Master, featuring this unknown character, who is perhaps Mr. Natural's future atheist friend, Professor Winowski, or possibly Crumb's future bandmate and documentarian, Terry Zwigoff. In the summer of 1967, we get the second published appearance of Mr. Natural in the second issue of Yarrow-Stocks, or is it Yarrow-Stocks? Thoughts in the comments. Here we have Head Comics, Hey Bop or Rebop. This is a bit of a non sequitur rhyming beat comic. You know, it's a bunch of strange nonsense mostly that kind of just rolls into the next thing. It's more concerned with rhythm than narrative. But in the final line, we see Mr. Natural waking up, and he says, "A dream about my youth." And there's strange writing on his hand. But before he can read it, Angel Food McSpade, in her first appearance, licks the ink off of his hand, destroying it forever. So the old hoochie coochie man chases her around amorously, saying, "Hubba, hubba, hubba." So even if we're to understand that this is a dream of Mr. Natural's youth, we still can't really gain any real lore from this particular comic. But even if it's a minor appearance, it does establish one more important Mr. Natural trait. He's horny, folks. Over the next 2 issues of Yarrow-Stocks, there are several comics with Mr. Natural and Flaky that would establish for the reader at the time the relationship between the two, their conversational dynamic. Of course, we're already privy to that in the canon since we're using the complete Crumb Volume 4. But there's a couple mini strips that are worth pointing out because they do establish what I feel is an important component to Mr. Natural's mystical system. We get 2 strips with shoe gags. In one strip, we find Flaky Foont incredulously sent to pick from a literal shoe tree. In another, a character takes Mr. Natural's advice to go polish his shoes literally, and Mr. Natural angrily says, "I meant the shoes of your soul." Now, it may seem silly, but this shoe symbolism carries through with Mr. Natural for the next 4 decades. Here in Mystic Funnies number 1, we find Flaky squandering the opportunity to glean some wisdom from Mr. Natural's shoes. And there's this puzzler on the back cover of that same issue. So we can add one final component to our checklist, mystic shoe symbolism. So that pretty much takes us up to Zap number 0, which predates issue 1, but was released after with this cover. But there's one more comic I want to look at, one that really explores the lore of Mr. Natural. While this is primarily an old Pooparoo story, in it we learn that Mr. Natural and the old Pooparoo were childhood friends. Eventually they got separated, and the old Pooparoo went into big business and lost sight of his friend. For a while, Mr. Natural worked in Chicago, doing skyscraper construction before eventually hitting the road. He turns to a life of petty crime, running with a woman from Tulsa named Judy Holliday. Not that Judy Holliday. Eventually they had a kid together, and Mr. Natural is forced to abandon his family when the law catches up to him. He gets charged and sentenced to 10 years for seducing a minor. Eventually, the now bearded Mr. Natural escapes and looks up his famously constipated former friend, the old Pooparoo. Apparently seeking revenge, he finds him. However, Mr. Natural, in fact, does not hold a grudge, and instead he cures the old Pooparoo's constipation, and they sing a song about shrinking hemorrhoids, and also Tommy the Toilet is there. Presumably this jingle about hemorrhoids was some sort of thing in the 50s or 60s that I am unaware of. Now, this particular comic was drawn before Zap number 0, but wasn't published until late 1968 in R.Crumb's Head Comics. Other than the comic The Origins of Mr. Natural from 1970, this is easily the biggest glimpse into Mr. Natural's early years that we'll ever get. And it'll be interesting when we get to that comic to look back at this one and try to spot any contradictions in the canon. Well, Crumb Bums, this is the end of the first episode of Canonically Crumb. If you've enjoyed this program, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, be a ding-dong daddy, and ding that bell. I've been your host, Kyle Bridget. You can find my links in the show description, and join me in the Nostril Zone, where we listen to tunes and draw cartoons every Sunday from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Central Time. And if you'd like to support this program and myself, you will find my Patreon in the show description as well. Canonically Crumb will be back next week or so with another deep dive into the Crummy-verse. Probably a little shorter than this one. So thanks again, Crumb Bums, and keep on rolling along.